I am intrigued by this notion of preparing people in advance, knowing what you're supposed to do. I mean, the story of the soldier who had his ideas about what's protective against PTSD. I mean, what you're speaking about there is this issue that the military are grappling with now called moral injury, which is a sense of losing your moral compass. Moral injury is often a gateway to things like post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. And I think there's a lot of truth to what that soldier said, because I think if you've got a very clear idea about what you're supposed to do, what your boundaries are, if you understand in advance that there's going to be things over here that are unpleasant, but this is what needs to be done, and if you prepare people in advance that way, in a sense, you can minimize the likelihood of someone developing this moral hurt. And by doing that, potentially, at least, you might reduce the odds of getting something like post-traumatic stress disorder or depression. So I think that there is a lot of truth to that. And that all boils down to education. How do you educate people correctly? And the other point that I could just pick up, which is something that Dave said, which really resonated with me, was you've obviously thought this out so carefully. The idea of having to do very difficult work when you're exhausted kind of reduces your resilience. I came across it so powerfully after 9/11 when I was interviewing journalists who were looking at these ghastly images of people jumping out of the World Trade Center. But they were working 18, 19, 20 hours a day. They were not sleeping, and they were arriving at work vulnerable because they were just so exhausted. And then they were being asked to step into this very difficult work situation and do this kind of work when they were exhausted. They were not eating properly. The whole their lives had been turned upside down. They weren't seeing friends. They weren't socializing. They'd given up on activities that formerly they enjoyed, like jogging, etc. Their whole world had been subsumed by the trauma, and that's very, very unhealthy. Sigmund Freud, I'm not a Freudian, but Freud said people become fixated to their moment of trauma. And they do in a sense because they're trying to make sense of it. You're trying to gain mastery of this traumatic event. And that's an understandable reaction. But it's very important that you need to let go of that as well, because when you're fixated with it day in and day out, as you can do with all this ghastly trauma, it undermines your resilience. It weakens you.
I'd say this, and I really want to try to bring this to journalists, and I really want to hear your thoughts and questions. There's a bit of a disconnect for me, because one of the things that we haven't figured out in journalism is we don't have the resources, right? To anticipate, yes, I think some of our leaders are getting a little smarter. This is going to be a tricky thing. We need to make sure there are people who are advanced planning for their own purposes, but I don't think we have enough people on the ground. So you may be familiar with Kurt Petrovich's sort of very public documentary, and it's not just his documentary, it's also his wife's documentary, as they talk about their story about his repeated foreign assignments covering typhoons and all of that sort of stuff. When we assign someone there, we assign one or two people, right? And they're working kind of around the clock to multiple masters. We don't have the luxury. And so unfortunately, to me, there's a bit of a disconnect as we talk about anticipating, because most media organizations are so bare bone, and working these long hours are kind of part of the cult of what we do, because we feel like, we spent all this money to get the one or two people there. We got to milk every little bit out of it. But anyway, I'm speaking a little bit beyond my knowledge, because I'm not a foreign correspondent, and that part of the news organization has probably thought this through more so than the kind of things that I think are not more common, but are common to my experience, but for the daily journalists, where you don't think about this as much, where I think there is a risk for people covering horrible crimes, murders, suicides, court cases. Anyway, that's one thing, but I'd be very curious to hear people's thoughts on this question about how our newsrooms can do this better.